Good evening, campers. It's me, Kieran, and today we are going to talk about a very good book. Now, if you are part of the BOOCLUB book club, then you will know what book we are going to talk about. Yes, that is, you could also have just looked at the title below when you clicked on this video. Today we are going to talk about Francis Spufford's light Perpetual. Now, prior to going into this book, as is the things with Booker, I had heard people's thoughts on this. I had watched reviews and there always seemed to be some concern about the plot. Let me tell you what that is. London 1944. A group of people have come to Woolsworths. There has been a new delivery of saucepans. Due to the war efforts, perpetuating make do and mend and use what you can and savour on, make sure that the metal goes to the soldiers with the idea that they could now replace the old with a brand new. Mothers take their children to Woolsworth to buy brand new aluminium saucepans. And while they're gazing at the metal, what they're not seeing is a V2 bomb heading their way. There's nothing they could do to prevent it. They can't stop it. And they're unaware that it's going to happen, that they are going to be blasted. Out of all those people who died, Spufford takes 5 people, 5 children, and gives them lives, decides what will happen to them. What could have happened to them? What if the bomb never hit that Woolworths? How would they live? Now, that incident in November 1944 did happen. A V2 bomb did hit a Woolsworth that had a delivery of new saucepans in London. But Spufford's London doesn't exist. It's in a borough of Bexton. It's not on a map. These 5 children never existed. All of the characters within his story are fictionalized. The main criticism, and yes, I want to talk about this now before I talk about the book, because it sets up everything else, and that is, well, if this is a real bomb that hit a real Woolsworth, that had a real delivery of saucepans, and it really did kill 163 people, women and children, why has he decided to fictionalize everything? The bomb, the borough of London, the lives, and therefore the complete fictionalization of this tale. What is the point of all this? Now, if you dig into Spufford's back catalogue, you'll realise he's a really tricky guy, and this is just something that he does. I suppose there is a case to make that this piece of fiction relies on non-fiction in order to fictionalise itself, which feels redundant. But if you consider his non-fiction, what he specialises in and what the majority of his writing career has been in, he does the same. He takes the non-fiction to fictionalise it, to inform the non-fiction. To give you an example, let's talk about one of his more recent non-fiction works, Red Plenty, which was longlisted for the Orwell Prize in 2011. Now, that book predominantly dealt with the 1950s Russian economics and how communism kind of built itself up to how it was going to beat capitalism. But he fictionalizes parts of those books and he leans into sci-fi using a lot of the modes and methods the sci-fi falls on without actually making the book sci-fi. Furthermore, in a non-fiction book, you would expect an index, but Spufford doesn't. He gives you a 53-page essay on the convergence of fact and fiction and how there's overlap. This is just a thing Spufford does, and for readers it can feel almost counterintuitive and it's head scratching. And there were times I was reading this going, hang on, like, what are we doing now? Are you telling me about Britain through the decades? Are you telling me about these lives? Do these lives even matter? What you think fiction should do are the stories that you're used to. Spufford almost runs away from it. He goes like, no, like, we're not going to do that. And at times that is frustrating because you're thinking, wait, but he's built it up to be this thing. And he doesn't. And after the halfway point, I completely fell in love with this. It didn't take too long into this novel before I was completely bowled over and seduced by Spufford. I absolutely love this book. Let's talk about the V2 rocket. The V2 rocket is coming down from the sky until we have T minus the detonation of the event. And time here slows down. We get the minute detail of what's happening. We see that bomb come down. We see the hairline crack until the energy, the carnage, and the blast is going to happen. He slows everything so slowly. And then we have T plus 5 years on from that event. And we see the children in school. We see them with their families and how ordinary they are, how British they are. This is a very British novel. There's no way of getting around this. 3 days later, about 6 hours sleep, I think I'm ready. This book, and yes, it would be an absolute shame if I didn't mention this, does start with a bang. But we're really dealing not with the explosion, we're dealing with the shrapnel and everything that flings off from the blast radius. And that really is these 5 children. They are flown through time, throughout London, where they settle within this imagined borough. Where they settle within this imagined borough of Bexton doesn't really matter. This is not a story where the characters interconnect. These are not interconnected stories or narratives. And I think that might, again, frustrate people. You would think that they would interweave and intertwine. They would engage with each other. And they do to some degree, but not always. And I think that has to do with the structure of this novel. From the blast radius, we move 5 years down the line, and every single jump in time is every 15 years. Each part of this novel, therefore, is set in a different decade. And how much of that decade are we going to cover? One day. We have 65 years to cover, but we're only going to look at 5 days in those 65 years. There are swathes of gaps and silence that we as a reader are not privy to the information. Therefore, the characters could have interacted. They could speak to each other. They could bump down the street and have a bit of a chinwag. Spufford's made a bold choice here, and I would understand the criticism of, well, isn't this just 5 short stories of different characters just pushed together in a novel? Yeah. Why don't the character stories interconnect? Why is this bomb that killed them never referenced at all? This book reminds me of a very specific phrasing, which I don't really hear as much as I used to hear back in school. That's the most prominent one in my head. And people would be smoking, and someone would always turn around and be like, oh, you shouldn't smoke. And the rebuttal would be, well, I could be run over by a bus tomorrow, what does it matter? Basically the long form of YOLO, I suppose. It's that, well, if I am to die, I am to die. And Spufford treats his characters as just normal people. The fact that they survived the bomb and what he imagines them doing is very ordinary and mundane. These 5 people aren't extraordinary. They are not going to solve world hunger. They're not going to bring peace or cure cancer or find new discovery. They're just ordinary British people. They're just people. They're people who fall in love. They're people who fall out of love. They're people who have aspirations. There's people who lose their dreams. They're people who are sexually assaulted. They're people who are sexually manipulative. They're people who fall into racism. They're people who deal with racism. They're people who want to share their love, and there's other people who just want to see others burn. These are 5 people going through the motions of life and living in a Britain that is moving on from the war. We see the metropolis of London become to what it is today. And I have to say, each decade is so distinct. Even the fact that when we move up to 2009, Spufford very early drops in a wheatgrass shot. Like, it's so painfully accurate. Effortlessly, each decade is defined. Key moments in British history and pivotal points do crop up because that's what people do. They talk about things that are affecting them there and then. He's not heavy-handed or hitting you over the head. Neither is he patronising. These things just crop up in conversation with people. And all of the characters here have such distinct voices. If you want a masterclass in characterization and dialogue, this book is it. There are so many characters who crop up, even fleeting characters, and they just stand out on a page. Of the main 5 characters, we see them develop and age, and it's not to say that they become wiser, especially Vern, who is a business-hungry man who just wants to make some money. He's kind of like a Gary V. I hate Gary V. Knows exactly what to do and how he's going to do it, but he hits pitfalls all the time. But it's never Vern's fault, it's someone else's. And seeing him as a 65-year-old man still whinging about money, and that he's just never changed. He's just never changed. It's just a delight. He was one of my favourites, Vern. You then have Ben, who has a fixation on cannibalism, and he's almost consumed by thoughts of charred ribs and burnt flesh. I won't tell you how that progresses, but you gotta read the book for that. This might sound like a bright, jovial work, but Spufford's not afraid to move into the dark. We deal with topics such as child abuse. One of the characters becomes embroiled in a neo-Nazi group. One part investigates racism in Britain. And even though further on in the novel we talk about diversity, inclusion and multiculturalism, Spufford's always making you aware that this is still happening. It might look as though we're making strides, but there's a past here that we still need to acknowledge. Spufford to some degree allows his characters to reflect, but they are living in the moment. They're living in that present day. More so, the reader, we have seen all their life. We've seen them grow up. We've seen how sometimes they don't reflect, how they don't react, how they don't see the consequences of their actions. It's very easy to point out someone else's flaws, someone's history, someone's past. It's very difficult for the finger to point at oneself. The most difficult part of this novel is that you know that these children died young from this V2 bomb, but now we've seen them grow up. We've seen them become elderly people. And unlike the bomb, when they didn't know they were going to die, now they have to face that. Now they have to understand that, well, what happens when I die? Where will I go? What is there for me to do? And one of the characters says, 15 years is nothing. It seems like a moment ago. And time moves so quickly, be it a V2 rocket falling from the sky, be that a coffin being lowered in the ground. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. I adore Spufford's style. I like that he's taking this risk with his writing. Like Perpetual, you can have a 9 out of 10.